This video guide will walk you through the key steps to creating the Tiger and the Woodman. The first area we're going to start with is the border. And this is always typically the best place to start, as it will help you get into the swing of the stitches on something that's a bit repetitive. So here you can see I'm using a straight stitch or satin stitch. Now there's a separate videos on all the individual stitches which you can refer to in the YouTube channel and on the website. You can see here I'm starting with dark grey. I tend to start from the widest part of the diamond and then work up and down around it. I just find this is the easiest way to achieving a uniform shape. Now you don't need to do this, but I find it's best to stitch, say, all the grey diamonds in a horizontal stitch the whole way around the border. And then I quite like doing the opposite colour, the white, in a vertical stitch. I think it adds quite a nice contrast, both in the colour and then the direction of the stitches. And you do notice it in the finished piece. It's by no means essential. What you can do is try to keep the same number of stitches going on each one, and that way you'll make sure each diamond is the same size and thickness. Again, don't worry too much about this though. So here you can see I'm starting to bring in the white thread, and you can see me doing exactly the same method but working in a vertical stitch. I again though start from the centre point and then I work out on either side. And this is one of the easiest stitches, just a plain satin stitch. You remember you can also go to the video which shows you getting started and splitting your thread, tying a knot, etc. It's quite a useful one if you're new to sewing, to be able to refer to before you get started. So once I've done that whole border, I then start doing the chain stitch around the outside. Now I would do the chain stitch after you've done the black and white diamond, but there's no reason that you have to say do whole border with black and white diamond before starting with the chain stitch. The reason it's quite nice to do at the end is it just means it hides any slightly untidy edges of the diamonds, which are always a little hard when you get to the small ones. So here you can see I'm using a chain stitch, and I'm choosing here to use the link method. This is always my preferred method. I think it makes a neater chain stitch, but do take a look. I've got videos for both loop and link methods, so you can see which one you prefer. You might find your chain stitch a little tricky to begin with if you haven't done it before, but you'll very quickly get into the swing of it. It tends to end up being people's favourite stitch. And that's really it when it comes to the border. You'll just continue working round in that manner. So now we come to the tree, and I'm going to start with the leaves in the lightest purple. So you can see I'm just roughly filling over where the marks are on the fabric. You don't need to worry about how neat these seem to be when you're up close, because the moment you just step back slightly from it, they'll look very neat. I would be generous though on how much thread you put down, because it's quite nice when they have a real 3D texture to them. So don't space the thread too far apart. Again, this is just a satin stitch, so you're using the same stitches which you've been using on the border. there is no reason when you're stitching all this that you need to say finish all the leaves and then move on to the trunk of the tree. I really dart around because I find it's the most fun way to stitch, is to have a bit of the leaves and then a bit of split stitch. So work however best suits you. So here you can see I'm starting doing the split stitch on the trunk of the tree. And all that really is just a straightforward stitch, but you end up splitting each of the ones you've been over previously. And the reason I like to use this here is because I think it gives really good coverage. Make sure you're not leaving any little red patches. I would just work on this side and then you can add in the next side and you'll both join up quite straightforward in the middle. Don't worry too much about how uniform you're being with where the stitches are going, or making sure each is the same length. Because you split it all, you really actually don't really notice at the end, and they're all quite nicely blended together. And here you go, I'm just repeating the exact same process but with dark purple on the other side. One thing just be careful of is just making sure you really do cover the white lines that are printed on the fabric, because you don't particularly want to see too much of that once you finish. So just get as close to those lines as you can. Now when the tree trunk gets this narrow section, then I'm just going to show you a little bit, because here I would just try to do a more straightforward satin stitch. You know, it's such a narrow section, there's no room to really split your stitches, and it's quite nice to keep all the stitches going in a consistent direction. So you see here I'm creating a bit of diagonal, and then I'm going to go in with dark purple on the other side, going a diagonal in the opposite direction, going upwards. It almost creates like a herringbone or V shape going down, which I think is a really nice textural point. And you'll just continue like this, and you'll use again the satin stitch at the bottom, and so it's a straightforward way to do the tree. So now we'll go on to the hunter, and I start with his hat, and this hat is a little bit fiddly because your stitches are a bit smaller, but it's really just exactly the same as what you were doing on the diamonds, where you're just going to fill in each one with the relevant colour. You'll find it looks a bit messy after you've just done one colour. Have faith, by the time you add in the second colour, it really all neatens up. So don't worry if at this stage you're looking at it and thinking, God, it's a mess. Right, so here you can see I'm starting to add in the dark purple. And as I add this in, you'll see how then you no longer see any of the white marks, and the whole hat becomes much more full of stitching. So I continue doing the hat in the same way, and you will find it takes a bit of time. Once you've finished it, you start doing the head. So I'm just doing this in really long satin stitches. So it means that as you stitch, you will end up covering over his eye and his ear. Try to remember the sort of rough positions they were in, but you can also always refer to the picture and the plan if you've forgotten. But then once you've finished it, then you'll go back over the top with your white thread and add the eye in. You might need to go over these stitches a couple of times just to make sure they really stand out in front of the green. So you can see here the first stitches kind of sink in a bit, and then I end up having to add in another stitch over the top. Then we'll start doing his body, and the coat again is all using your same satin stitch, so the stitch you'll be completely familiar with by now. So I'll just show you a small section of it, but you see here I'm starting to fill out the first section of his sleeve using the lightest purple, and just using really long satin stitches going side to side. You could mix this up and do any stitch you particularly want, but I think this is the nicest way, and it creates a really lovely finished effect. You can see here in a bit more detail exactly what I'm doing. I'm just going to keep the stitches going in the same direction and just adjusting the length, go curve round the various shapes. And then I will repeat the process with the dark purple. So I'm first just starting up around his neck with the dark purple, adding in again these long satin stitches across. And then I'm going to reduce into a shorter satin stitch as I start working down the bands on his coat. I do find sometimes these short ones are quite hard to keep really uniform, I find anyway. But don't worry about that, because by the time you've added in various other sections, you won't see that they're not that uniform. It will all look quite neat at the end. Now I'm going to exactly repeat the process now with the lightest of the greens. Now finally I'm just going in with the orange. I'm just going to show you here how I'm going to do the arrow. You can do this in a few different ways, but I think it's just good to change the direction of your stitch versus the band that's going down the middle of the jacket, just to make sure you differentiate the arrow from the jacket. Now I just do some narrow stitches along. I'm using a split stitch there, but you could actually use a chain stitch going down the centre. And then on the back of the arrow, I'm just going to do these stitches going in opposite directions, again to kind of create that V. You can see. You see I'm going to then just use the same process, satin stitch on the bow, but with a chain stitch for the band going across. So now finally we're on to the tiger, although I know this is a slightly more a lionish tiger. So here I'm using a split stitch, but in short sections a satin stitch. I really use a mix and change the direction quite a lot. And the main look I'm trying to achieve here is a real kind of blending in almost to create a fur type look. You see, it's just in these long sections I'm really using a mix of a split stitch and a satin stitch. In areas that you're going to end up going round in an outline, like around the eye, just only stitch to those lines, leaving yourself a bit of a guide so you'll know where to put your stitch later. So you see here now I'm just going in with the dark green. Now in the guide, I just suggest you do this right at the end once you've finished the whole of the tiger. But you can do it in sections as you go. It's just the key thing is just you want to do it after you've fully filled in threads because it helps to tidy up the edges of the tiger. And I'd just try to be as consistent as you can with the length of these stitches. That's the way that you'll make it look the smartest, is if each stitch is roughly the same sort of length. When it comes to the eye, just see I'm just going to still just using my little short stitches, and then I'm just going to put the iris of the eye in the middle. Again, you might just need to do this a few times just to make sure it's fully on top of the threads. So just do this with quite a few stitches. So the final thing that happens on the tiger is we add all his stripes using a chain stitch. Each stripe is roughly around about the width of 2 chain stitches, but if you take a close look at the picture that's in your instruction booklet, you'll be able to see how many rows of chain stitch I've done, and you can always repeat that. By this stage you will have been doing quite a lot of chain stitch and various stitches, so do kind of stitch it however you think it looks best. Now I won't show you the rest of the tiger, I think the rest should be relatively self-explanatory. You're just going to repeat the same process as you go. The key is just making sure you have good coverage as you work through. And remember the back leg is just the base colour is a different shade of green, it's the darker shade of green. But otherwise, I think you're good to go. So happy stitching and get in touch if you have any questions.